In previous videos, we've talked about the buffer class or the middlemen, who make up a sort of protective barrier between the ruling class and the elite on one end, and a class of people who are most targeted for exploitation on the other end. And so this system of social control has been established in different ways throughout history. But in this video, we're going to discuss how the European conquerors, and more specifically the Spanish, set up certain members from the native tribes to act in this role of the buffer class, and how many of these chiefs cooperated with these colonizers in the exploitation of their own people. And understanding how this system of control was established in this setting, it gives us some indirect insight on how the white race was set up and used in a similar capacity, which we'll talk more about in upcoming videos. But to understand how these native rulers were used as this buffer class, we're going to read from this book right here. It's called The Invention of the White Race, Volume 2 by historian Theodore Allen. So let's go in here and let's turn to page 32, where it says this. At the time of the Spanish invasion in 1519, the population of central Mexico, an area about 200,000 square miles, was an estimated 13.9 million, representing a density of almost 70 people per square mile. Of this population, 2.5 million, concentrated more than 350 per square mile, lived in the 8,000 square mile area in and near the basin of Mexico. Tenochtitlan, Mexico City, in the heart of this area, had a population of 300,000. The invaders found already in place an elaborate system of levy providing products of all kinds, slaves and services for the three capitals of the so-called Aztec Empire, and a similar system in other large states outside the Aztec territory. And so who were the invaders? The Spanish. And why were they coming to invade this foreign place? Was it to make more friends and to feed the homeless? No, it was to colonize both the land and the minds of the people, and to use them to become more wealthy. And so Allen says when the Spanish invaded, they already found in place an elaborate system of levy or authorized collections, which provided for slaves and services to support the Aztec Empire. And yes, they were dealing with owning people too, right? Just about every society from that time and before dealt in slaves. The freedom from physical ownership by another human that we're so familiar with today is a newly manifested idea. But let's continue. In each case, it was organized to support its central government ruling group. And so the system that the natives had already established in modern day Mexico City was set up in a way that looked after the ruling class people or the group of rulers. And keep listening, because we're going to see how the Spanish were able to capitalize off of this pre-existing setup. Here we go. Originally a three-layered stratum, the ruling group came to be designated by the Spanish under the general name of caciques. So Allen says the Aztec society already had a three-layered social system, which means that the burdened laborers were at the bottom of the system, which they had a middle layer filled with other people, and then the ruling group of people were at the top, right? And this was the class structure that they had. Now watch this. The Spanish were able to adapt this pre-existing form of social organization to extort labor and tribute from the Indians, even in the most rapacious or greedy manner, using Indian office holders at the subordinate levels of the hierarchy for the enforcement of Spanish rules. So as we can see, the Spanish used this already existing social structure to benefit themselves, and they used the office holders to reinforce Spanish rules, not the Aztec rules, but Spanish rules, which obviously were rigged in a way to make the Spanish be the ones who come out as the winners and for everyone else to lose or get the crumbs. Now here we go. In the opinion of the well-known historian of colonial Mexico, Charles Gibson, it was the power and prestige of the pre-Spanish states and their continuing tradition of popular subservience that made it possible for the Spaniards to exact labor and tribute with little opposition. Summarizing, Gibson writes that in both Mexico and Peru, Spaniards took charge of an established society, substituting themselves for the rulers they had deposed or killed. And so the Spanish had taken the top spot within that society, and they began calling the shots. But I want you to pay attention to what they did and why they did it. Now, here we go. But such a displacement at the top would not have been effective in gaining the Spaniards' purposes without the preservation of a buffer social control function for the socially demoted caciques, meaning they didn't completely get rid of all of the old ruling class. They used some of them as the buffer class or the middlemen, right? Which allowed the Spanish to control that society through the use of some of these caciques, who became the pawns in their game. Let's get some more. The ease with which the first Spaniards manipulated huge numbers of native peoples, even the ease with which the first missionaries induced huge numbers of conversions, depended upon the intermediate position of the caciques. Because the caciques could easily communicate with the masses of their people, and then they had a high influence in getting these people to accept the new system and the new reality, right? Isn't that much easier than a bunch of foreign people coming in there trying to convince all these people to change their ways? Of course it is, right? Which is why they kept some of them as the buffer class. Now let's continue. Caciques were in the vanguard, or leading the way, in the adoption of Spanish dress, foods, language, and styles of house construction. And so the Spanish used some of them as a tool to inject their culture into the society. And a change of culture means what? It means a change in mind, right? And so some of these caciques played an integral part in the transformation of the consciousness in the process of Spanish domination. But what was in it for them? That's the question. Let's find out. They were excused from tribute and labor exactions and given special privileges, such as permission to ride horses and carry arms. And so these were some of the crumbs that they fed to them in exchange for their cooperation. And while some of these caciques were distracted with these short-term gains, the Spanish were looking at the much broader and bigger picture, right? Of taking minds and dominating people by any means necessary. Now watch this. Indian caciques and Spanish corregidors, Spanish officers in charge of local districts, joined forces to extract from the mass of the Indian population whatever wealth it possessed over and above the subsistence level of its economy. And so they both teamed up to prey on the weak and vulnerable. And preying on other people is a tendency of this apex predator called the human, right? And it can be expressed in any human who allows it to be expressed through the human vessel. And there's no shortage of people out here from all backgrounds who have no problem preying on other people, right? Whether it's their own people or not, right? That doesn't matter. Let's keep reading. Considered in terms of social control and resistance, the story of the Spanish defeat and rule over the Inca civilization of Peru in the 16th century closely responds to the patterns set in Mexico. The Inca word for chiefs, curacas, was by Spanish decree in 1572 changed to cacique. Appropriately enough, it would seem, since the buffer social control function of that office in Peru was identical with its function in Mexico. The hereditary Peruvian caciques were exempt from paying tribute or labor service, similar to what we saw in Mexico City, right? So the Spanish used these Peruvian leaders in the same capacity as they used those leaders in Mexico, and they gave them similar crumbs for their participation. Let's continue. They were the collectors of tribute to be paid to the Spanish by Indians between the ages of 18 and 50. They were responsible also for furnishing the mita laborers for service to Spanish masters in industries, in farming, and, worst of all, in the silver and mercury mines of Potosi and Huancavelica. In Peru, the caciques exercised considerable power over Indians, even within the borders of Spanish towns. For at least a century and a half, the caciques of Mexico and Peru served as the principal buffer social control stratum in the Spanish system of social control in those domains. And so you see that? I want you to understand one thing, that there's reasons why these Europeans were able to go around most of the world and conquering it. Obviously, they had the hot firepower and great weaponry that other people didn't have. But on top of that, they also had a mentality that heavily focused on preying on other people, right? And when they focused intensely on these ideas of domination, they were able to look out into the real world and find every opportunity that presented itself to accomplish this type of mission and bring this idea into reality. And so with strong desires of conquering people, extracting labor out of people, and getting wealthy, coupled and combined with the advanced technology that they had, then we can understand how they were able to go around and dominate people on such a large scale, right? And so understand, they put a lot of energy and a lot of mental thought into these activities of domination. And they were willing to do whatever they needed to do and use whoever they needed to use, right? And that's including turning people against each other and creating new people if that's what they had to do, which is what they did, right, in instances. And so don't underestimate how serious this game is, right? Because they put a lot of effort into making it and creating it. And so from here, let's turn back to the Caciques. And what I want to do right now is go into a Wikipedia article, and I want to show you what they wrote about the Caciques in there so we can compare what they wrote to what it is that we just went over, right? Let's go in there and find out. Caribbean Caciques who did not initially oppose the Spanish became middlemen, serving as the interface between their communities and the Spanish. Their cooperation was frequently provisional, meaning temporary. Most of the early Caciques eventually revolted, resulting in their deaths in battle or by execution. And so many of them weren't having it, and that's probably because they caught wind of the game that the Spanish were setting up, and they decided that they didn't want to play that game, and they would rather die than to be caught up in it, right? Very understandable and commendable. Let's continue. Two of the most famous of these early colonial era caciques are Atué from what is now Cuba and Enriquillo on the island of Hispaniola. Both are now respected national heroes in Cuba and the Dominican Republic. The Spanish had more success when they drafted the leaders of the far more hierarchically organized indigenous civilizations of Central Mexico. These Central Mexican caciques served as more effective and loyal intermediaries in the new system of colonial rule. The hierarchy and nomenclature of indigenous leadership usually survived within a given community, and the Spaniards' designation of caciques did not usually correspond to the hereditary or likely candidate from a given system of indigenous leadership. As a consequence, elite indigenous men willing to cooperate with the colonial rulers replaced their rivals who had better hereditary or traditional claims on leadership. And so the Spanish set them up instead, right? The ones who raised their hand up and said, we are willing to play the middleman role. Let's continue. The Spanish recognized indigenous nobles as a European-style nobility within the newly established colonial system, and a cacique status among the colonizers, along with that of his family, was buttressed or strengthened by their being permitted the Spanish noble honorifics Don and Doña. As colonial middlemen, caciques were often the first to introduce European material culture to their communities. Just like we talked about earlier, right? They were used as the tool to transform the culture and the customs of the people. Let's continue. This is seen in the Spanish-style houses they built, the Spanish furnishings that filled them, and the European fashion they wore everywhere. They engaged in Spanish commercial enterprises such as sheep and cattle ranchers and sericulture. Many even owned enslaved Africans to operate these concerns. The caciques also acquired new privileges, unknown before contact. Now, let's find out what these are. These included the right to carry swords or firearms and to ride horses or mules. Now, you see that? So this here was just a glimpse on how the Spanish colonizers implemented the role of the buffer class, right? And Allen shows this in his book. And other examples as well as a forerunner to understanding how the colonists used the white race, right? The white race in a similar fashion, but with its own distinct modifications, which we'll talk more about in other videos, right? Coming up. And so hopefully this here has given you some insight and also has given you some extra light to find your way on the path and to get some more understanding and clarity about how the world is the way it is, right? And so I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.